All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA speaker session entitled Realities, Imperatives, and Principles of Great Power Competition, today and into the Biden administration. And I'd also like to briefly thank today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Lynch III, for taking the time to present today. So before we begin, I just have a few quick housekeeping items. So we'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the end of the brief. So during the brief or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions through the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles and one as a question mark. Also be sure to type in your name and affiliation before you submit your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded and on the record, you can go ahead and submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to him. Dr. Thomas Lynch III is a Distinguished Research Fellow at the Center for Strategic Research at the Institute of National Strategic Studies of the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Lynch researches, writes, lectures, teaches, and organizes workshops and conferences for the Department of Defense customers, primarily on the topics of great power competition and geopolitics, as well as India's strategic rise and the implications for Indo-Pacific security and stability. Dr. Lynch has also published a recent book entitled Strategic Assessment 2020 into a new era of great power competition. So Dr. Lynch, I'm going to turn the floor over to you now.
Hey, great, Nicole. Thank you very much. Let me go ahead and bring up the slides that I was preparing to share with you guys today and say that it's a delight to be here from rainy Washington, D.C., where it's always a pleasure to get a chance to brief and discuss things with a diverse audience. So my thanks to you all for being here today. As Nicole has mentioned in discussing my bio, my purpose of the chat today is really to kind of talk through and extend and expand on some themes and conclusions for a book I edited here, a compendium book on the new era of great power competition, and you'll see that referenced in the presentation. What I wanted to do with this august audience is get a chance to discuss a couple of the main conclusions out of that particular strategic assessment book on great power competition. Think about some of the implications of it for today, and then take it and extend it into what I think we are seeing right now with the dawn of the Biden administration in terms of the resonance of the framework of great power competition, in terms of some of the means in which great power competition is likely to be pursued by this administration, and then turn to your questions in the aftermath. So with that as the agenda here, and me having about 30 minutes to kind of introduce these themes, thanks for bearing with me, and then I'll look forward to your questions. So as Nicole has already said also, I have an obligatory theme topic here to mention, which is the obligatory disclaimer, and that is that what you're about to hear here are the results of my own research and assessments and don't necessarily represent either the policies or the views of my home institution, National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So what I want to do here today, with giving you the background slide as well here of the cover of the book, is kind of dive into what is the final quarter of that book, really 2 chapters entitled "Preparing to Compete," after having laid out some of the framing ideas about great power competition. And so what I want to do today is in 3 short chunks, first kind of recap several of the main features of some items earlier in the book that kind of lay out what we meant and what I and the co-authors of that book talked about in terms of what great power competition is, how we got to that place, and why this new era resonates with a lot of older multipolar great power competition periods, but not so much with the unipolar world that many of us grew up in the last 30 years, or the bipolar world of the Cold War, which many of us were born into and some like to touch point with, but we'll talk about why that may not be such a good idea. Then I'll talk about briefly what we refer to in the book as 4 key principles of great power competition historically in multipolar moments, as well as some of those things that are not relevant today in terms of key principles for great power competition. And then the third section is that extension and the way ahead talking about American foreign policy considerations in an era of multipolar competition and kind of what the emerging contours of the Biden administration are starting to look like, and really starting to look like just this month. So I'm going to highlight some of the things that many of you may be tracking that the Biden administration put out here in the first week of March. So that's my agenda here in the next few minutes, and I'll thank you for bearing along here. What I wanted to do is really highlight and frame for you the fact that, and I know you've had some discussions on this, I think, in the SMA forum in the past, is that, you know, we really have arrived at a period now talked about by a majority of commentators as an era of great power competition, you know, in the last 4.5 to 5 years. The documents that really kind of, you know, anchored and established that as fully recognized were the documents of 2017 and 2018 that many of you are familiar with. And that was President Trump's national security strategy of December 2017, and then the national defense strategy of 2018. And what these documents basically framed and characterized was a global description, a description as this new era as featuring a reemerging period of multiple large great power states competing with each other as opposed to cooperating or collaborating with each other. And of course, the two that joined America in this competition are Russia and China. So Russia and China had transformed from rivalrous states to now openly and assertively challenging ascendant American power, influence, and interests. So part of what we try to do in the book then is make sure that we're being clear about some of the terms here that get, you know, discussed in a lot of different frameworks by a lot of different pundits. And so in thinking about competition, there's been quite a bit of discussion the last 4 or 5 years about how, you know, America needs to be set and ready to, you know, confront China, to demand certain things from Russia, questions about how we can ever possibly, you know, cooperate with these states that are our rivals. And so in trying to understand the first term of great power competition, the 3 words in that term, you know, I think it's important to understand that competition is not conflict and it's not clash. Really, you know, competition exists on a continuum of state-to-state interactions. And we try to define that in the book, and I'll come back to that in a couple of slides. And so, you know, where pure cooperation is a rare thing, and thankfully armed warfare and clash between particularly great powers is a rare thing, you know, just because we're moving from a period where we have lots of engagement and cooperation into one that is more competitive doesn't mean we're automatically moving into clash and armed warfare. Now, what it does mean, though, is we've moved on a continuum where our interactions with other great powers are a lot more competitive. And so they vary between collaboration, little chance for cooperation, and more preparation for confrontation and potential conflict. So that's one dynamic that I wanted to raise here because I'll come back to it in a couple of seconds. Second, this notion about power. And, you know, there are hundreds of books written about, you know, what is power in a state-to-state, you know, framework. Well, it's a multifaceted construct, I think, is the most, you know, correct thing one can say. And, you know, it ranges between states using, you know, hard power, which is generally coercion or the coercive use primarily of military or economic terms, to get influence on other states or actors as payoff. And then there's soft power, which tends to be used more as attraction between states, you know, through things like partner economics, ideological appeal, social affinity, and cultural acumen. So the difference here is, you know, power on its many different constructs really kind of has a hard side and a soft side, and it's the combination of those two that gain and win sustained influence by states amongst each other. And then finally, there's this notion of greatness. And that tends to be, and has been in the last 3 to 4 years, robustly debated, particularly in terms of whether or not we have a state of 2 great powers or 3 great powers. And I think the construct that we established in the book is a framework that it captures a lot of, you know, the most significant literature in the last 25 or 30 years about what great powers are and are not. And it's a threefold construct. And those threefold elements are, first, is it a country that has unusual capabilities? And of course, in the post-World War II era, nuclear weapons are certainly amongst the things that are unusual capabilities, but not the only things. And indeed, you know, very robust wealth, very robust means of of finance and capabilities are also things that add into whether or not a state is really great or not so great in the modern era. Second, though, it's important to note that just because a state has unusual capabilities doesn't make it a great power. It has to do with a second element also, and that is whether or not those capabilities are used by that state to pursue broad interests and beyond its immediate neighborhood. And I'll say that again, broad interests beyond the immediate neighborhood. And so a country that I work with a lot, India, in analysis, arguably has a lot of the critical and unusual capabilities that would make a state a great power. But when one looks at what India has and does, one doesn't see India applying those capabilities robustly in pursuit of broad interests or beyond its immediate neighborhood. So I think that's an important distinction and discriminating characteristic. And finally, the other element of this is, do other states in the system perceive this state to be major? That is, do they perceive this state to be relevant to their calculus on what they can and cannot do or should not do with their own actions? And here, when one looks at that kind of a three-element framework, I think one has to realistically assess that we are in a period where there are three great states, right? China, Russia, and the US all fit these threefold characteristics and definitions, and no other state in the system right now fits the threefold definition or is likely to fit the threefold definition, certainly for the foreseeable future, and likely for at least a decade. And so that's kind of framing how we're at and where we're at, and why the discussion of this is a multipolar period. Now, the next thing that we kind of do in the book that I'm not going to do a lot of here because we just haven't got time is to assess then how do states compete with each other. And I think it's pretty obvious that it's not just in military and economic terms, right? There are political components, there are ideological components, and especially in modern times, they're what we call in the book informational components. And that's how states exchange information back and forth, right? We're way beyond the era of the courier pigeon or the telegraph, or even the television, as quaint as that is. We're now into social media, we're into social exchanges, we're into whether you have an open or transparent internet or a closed and restrictive internet. So all those things are places and areas where states compete with each other, and certainly the great powers compete with each other in those main competitive elements. Now, over history and over time, what we establish in the book, though, by leveraging and looking at some of the great historical rivalries that have featured multiple challengers, and particularly looking at the last 500 years, is a move into a great power competitive period beyond where we've been the last 30 years or so, where the United States was a dominant power, gives one pause to think about stability and security in the international arena during this period. Because whereas over the last 500 years, we've not seen relatively a ton of time where we've had either unipolar international configurations or bipolar configurations, we've seen a lot of multipolar configurations. The news from those periods, when one studies them over 500 years, is that pure cooperation between multiple large or great powers is relatively unusual. So too, thankfully, is violent clash and warfare. So what's more likely to be seen during these periods is competition in those other areas of state-to-state interaction. Okay, and competition means sometimes conflict, sometimes collaboration, sometimes even cooperation in certain areas. So a longer haul dynamic here, not something that's going to end quickly or correctly and properly like sometimes we like to have it with an instantaneous society. Second, in the past 5 centuries, what happens in periods of great power competition is there's also invariably a great power transition that is in the same era. And these tend to play out over decades and not years. And this features, one or more rising powers with relative power increase versus a state or states that were in the ascendant position that now perceive a relative decline. And what we found in our research kind of bore out some of the other, great literature of the last decade or so, which is 75% or 3/4 of these great power transitions have concluded with or featured during a destructive period of violent war or clash. So that's not good news. I mean, that kind of tells you statistically that odds are not on your side in seeing a rising power and an ascendant power work things out so you don't wind up in clash. Having said that, though, it's not inevitable. All right. And it's important to note that, great powers can channel or expend their worst animus in other categories of competition, and they need not wind up in a period of clash or highly destructive war amongst those great power entities. But it takes a lot of leadership and a lot of effort in history to not get to that point. And so when we looked in the book, we kind of looked at 4 representative multipolar periods of great power competition. And I'm going to tease you to look at the book because there is a summary of conclusions in the book that goes into this. And I'm not going to address even the 7 bullets that you see here, but I'm going to flag for you kind of 4 things that I think are important to set up before, I move to the next part of the presentation. And that is, as already mentioned, that great power transitions within great power competitive periods really pose the dominant states and the rising states with a conundrum. How to recognize this change of relative power without provoking an outright clash. So the dominant power has to figure out how to accommodate a rising challenger that both avoids the destructive clash and, more importantly here perhaps, an unacceptable change in the preferred status quo. Second, we drift towards great power war when conflictual demands between a rising and an ascendant power or grievances tend to align and across the 5 major areas of competition. When this happens, when there's no space for cooperation or a collaboration, you tend to see the great powers drift towards war. The most reliable indicator of when a great power clash or war will erupt is when both sides in the dynamic shift of power transition see an inevitable alignment of particularly economic and military power that they perceive to be immutable, that is, it's going to happen no matter what, and they perceive it as being untenable. That is, it's unacceptable to us under any terms or any circumstances. When you arrive at that point, then historically, that's the point at which preparations for and actual execution of war tend to occur. I flag up here for you the 4th point as well, though, in that a lagging but reliable indicator of when great powers are approaching war is when you have caustic information exchanges. That is, when each side of that rivalry, that dyadic rivalry, starts to treat the other people as inhuman, incapable of rational decision making, and therefore not worth engaging in a collaborative or cooperative process. And so one needs to be careful of that, and I'll come back to that in a couple of seconds. Finally, I'll skip down to the last point here to reinforce the notion that this historical review suggests that in periods of multipolar great power competition, while the drift towards war is definitely correlated with those periods, that extraordinary political leadership matters. Okay, it's not foreordained that rivalrous powers will clash, and managing domestic as well as international factors is the leadership challenge in these periods and the thing that tells you whether or not you're going to have the clash or not. Now, what does that mean for today? Well, as I've mentioned and alluded to, I think we kind of establish in the book, and I think much of the literature today acknowledges that we had this very anomalous period of unipolarity as well as extensive cooperation in the world from about 1992, the end of the Cold War competition period, right up and through probably 2014 or 15. From 92 to 2007, it was pretty clear that 1, there was no other great power rival to the United States, and 2, everybody was trying to figure out how to cooperate and collaborate with the United States, with the exception of non-state actors, right? But the other states were kind of in that place. By 2008, though, things start to waver, obviously, between Russia initially, with some of the statements by Vladimir Putin in 07 and 08, and then Putin's invasion of Georgia, and then also in 08 in China, the fact that there was domestic unrest that the world, was kind of supporting and that China took umbrage to. Then there was, and oftentimes this is lost, I think, by us in the West, there was the economic recession of 08 and 09. Now, if you look at the literature, particularly in China, but also in Russia at that time, particularly because China felt that it had to weigh in economically and cooperate to bail out the United States and its Western partners, the Chinese took from that the fact that America's system, the Western system, is inherently corrupt. It does not resonate It is not long for this world, and therefore it is not something that we should be cooperating with as a point principle in fact. Yet we in America, I think, pretty much from 08 to 09 to 14 or 15, wanted to read the tea leaves as being more cooperative than they were. We really wanted things to be where they were. We wanted Russia and China to become more like us. And it took until activities in 2014 and 15 for the United States to kind of have those foundational collaborative premises shaken, right? And so by the time we get to the end of the Obama administration, we start to see the United States reacting and sanctioning Russia. We start to see the United States sanctioning and calling out China for some of its business practices. We start to see de facto great power competition. And as I mentioned earlier, by 2017 with the national security strategy, we have that as acknowledged formally. Everybody's acknowledging it. The three great powers acknowledge it, and national strategy in the United States clings and adheres to it. So my point on this subsequent slide is to say that whereas in the 92 to 2004-15 period, we were kind of framed initially in cooperation and collaboration as the dominant aspect of interstate relations, we started to transition in 08 to 15 or so. And then by 2017, we are now in this framework where you bracket competition, I think, with some elements of collaboration and some elements of confrontation as the major dynamics between the three great powers, and particularly between the US-China dyad, where it's China's rise and the United States ascendance that are the things that are the transitional dyad in this period, where Russia still matters, but where Russia is not obviously a rising great power. It is instead a great power, with some limitations, but playing its cards very well. So where does that take us then to how to understand today? First, we are in a more normal international system period. It's more normal over the last 500 years to see a number of great powers, multi-great powers beyond two, as jousting and competing for ascendance and norms and procedures internationally. That's more normal. But during those periods, great power transition, which in this case is more like the China-US dyad, tends to correlate with higher levels of clash, okay? When a dissatisfied rising power meets a status quo that the standing power does not want to deal with or alter. And so there is this instability and there is this increased risk of major war that the state leaderships of each of the countries are having to grapple with right now. So out of that, what are the kind of imperatives from that understanding? Well, I think there are three main imperatives that I wanted to highlight for you that we kind of get into in the book. The first two are on this slide. And none of them are unique or earth-shattering, but I think they're very important. Starting with alliances and partnerships. Historically, countries that have allies and partners in great power competitive periods do better than those that do not. Now, that doesn't mean that alliances and partnerships don't require challenging moments with the leaders of the partnerships or the partners themselves. Okay, so there is that dynamic. What is important to understand, though, is that a main U.S. comparative advantage with China right now is our history of building alliances and partnerships. Okay, we have an array of allies and partners with common ideologies and common political values, and China has nothing. As a guy who's worked South Asia for a long time and looked at the Pakistan-China relationship, I think it is well understood that if China has any friend in the world, it's Pakistan. You can't even count North Korea as a friend for China because of the way they behave. So, China has no experience with friendships or partnerships. And that is a distinct advantage for America in a period of great power competition where there's a major power transition. And so, if we treat our partners well and we engage with them and we don't have them right now make stark economic choices, between us or the Chinese, I think we can expect that alliances and partnerships will be receptive to, what some scholars call targeted economic disengagement, and that I advocate and we advocate the paper, that's not decoupling from the Chinese economy, but in selected areas is stepping back and disengaging supply chains where there are great risks to security issues for the US and the West if China is too involved, or where there are great issues for human rights if China is too involved. So this notion of targeted disengagement, but understanding that most of our partners, particularly in the Indo-Pacific right now, don't want to be forced to choose between America and their Chinese, partners in economics. Okay, so stark decoupling is not a good thing for the U.S. to pursue at this point as we rebuild alliances and partnerships. The second thing that we highlight here in the concluding elements that I wanted to raise here is a domestic factor, a domestic imperative. And that is to understand, America's own history in economics and its own history in competitive periods that are not like the previous 30 years of the U.S. ascendancy. And that is, there's this myth in America that we are pure laissez-faire private economics, and that, we're best when we're that, and governments don't engage, and when they do, it's socialism and it's a problem. And I'm the first to acknowledge that governments can get over-involved in economics and mess them up badly. And there are dozens of examples of that globally. But to look at America's history is to understand that American government has targeted government intervention for strategic issues and strategic interests multiple times in our history. And we've done it especially during periods of times of great power competition. Pre-World War II, which with such things as Lend-Lease, where I put the little graphic up there in the middle of the slide, Franklin Roosevelt cleverly authorized U.S. government intervention and stimulus because the Lend-Lease program that sent, as you see in the dollar values there, almost $11 billion overseas. I mean, none of that was paid for actually initially by those governments, the UK or the Soviet Union or other countries. U.S. taxpayers paid for that. And that allowed Roosevelt to target certain parts of American industry into areas that he knew we were going to need if we went to war. He knew that Detroit had to have some experience in building airplanes that bombed things and that were fighter planes. And so the stimulus package for Lend-Lease helped those factories convert in that direction. And there are dozens of examples in the Cold War. So I mention that because there's a lot of rhetoric out there about how, America, investing and manipulating and getting involved in modern technologies is anathema to, how we succeed and how we win. And I think if you look at great power competitive periods, that's not true. All right. And there's a point at which we need to be involved up to a point to do that well. And we can and should smartly invest in critical technologies and systems. I list a couple of them here: AI, 5G, quantum, the Internet of Things, to make sure that our agencies have individual autonomous capacity between us and our allies where we can sustain a long-term competition and be prepared for confrontation should that come with the rising challenge from the Chinese. Okay. And the other thing about this is, in today's terms, it's clear that the U.S. Investment and innovation base does a great job with things like, commercial apps, right? I mean, if you want to find an app that'll do something to get you groceries or to help you, make your face become a cat face, so you can virtually project it to others, I mean, we're the place to go, right? We got that under control. But there's a lot of other stuff that's being done, not commercial stuff, where there's not enough demand, arguably, in the United States or the West, and therefore government has a legitimate role in asking that commercial technology centers focus on things that are more important to strategy and strategic applications in this area. The third thing about imperatives that I wanted to go through a little bit is, kind of what this period is not. And it is not a redux of the Cold War. More on that in a couple of seconds. And I mention that because particularly over the last 2 years, you as I may have seen an awful lot of op-eds, editorials, other commentary about how we just need to, make China our Cold War adversary, and that's how we're going to do things. And really, it's not. And there are a number of reasons for that in a couple of seconds. And the other thing we're not anymore, and I think, Americans in some corners have to get their arms around this, is we're not in this unipolar moment where we, tip the balance of the scales and no one else could compete with us, and therefore we got our own way. We're neither of those points anymore on the continuum of interactions. So what does that mean? Well, particularly in terms of the Cold War analogy, I think we need to understand the difference between a competitive mindset that existed in the Cold War versus false analogies that we are or should be in a Cold War with the Chinese. And there are several dimensions of that. First, I think it's important to understand that China is not about right now a new zero-sum ideology, right? There is little to no evidence right now that China wishes any time in the near term to replace the current international order, the liberal international order, with its own ideas or its own systems. And therefore, China is very different than the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had its own global communist parties movement. It had its thing called the Second Comintern. It was actively engaged in undermining and trying to, take over countries around the world. And it sponsored proxy warfare around the world. We see none of that with the Chinese right now, thankfully. And we should be careful, I would argue, that we not push the Chinese in that direction, because they don't seem to have an instinct right now to do that. Second, extending that point, China right now is not about trying to project its own ideology. It certainly has its own development model, all right? But that's not unique. Other states have done this as well, being really invested in commercial activities. China's successes, reflect its priorities. Okay, and it's open to more international control, and certainly it has commonality with a lot of autocracies around the world, or totalitarian states, in that it doesn't question or challenge the way they do business. But that's not the same as projecting an ideology out from Beijing to other parts of the world. Indeed, what we're really talking about here, I think that's more appropriate to understand, is we're in a moment where the US-China competitive dyad is really one about trying to see who can best project legitimate authority, okay? And here, global perception of legitimacy, is historically important, right? That other states don't see a country as just about intimidation or about size or mass, but they also are grounded in a community-wide belief in appropriate behaviors and a shared identity, all right? And so it's in that area of ideological competition for legitimate authority that gets transferred into organizations, norms, rules, and procedures across, a global framework that really is kind of what the competition is about, not some stylized and misapplied notion that we're in some ideological contest with a Soviet Union redux that's trying to replace everything internationally. So the theme here is it's more important to understand this is a competitive arena for legitimate authority in the international system, not some ideological great joust or clash in the arena. And that's an important imperative to understanding great power competition as it exists today. So that's kind of a star there by that level of competition, noting that it's very important and that it's very different than it was during the Cold War period. Next, the idea here is that a country that pursues legitimate norms and procedures, leveraging allies, more about that in a second, does better because China tends to pursue right now bilateral influence, whereas a wider set of countries working with a U.S. system could build multilateral cooperative frameworks that work in economics, that work in politics, that work in informational spheres, and that work in the military, providing a critical counterbalance to what China is offering right now as tweaks or changes to the system, and making countries more likely to want to stay the course with a U.S. desired framework. Next, I talked about this earlier, so just going to mention it here for a second, and we can talk about it more in Q&A. But before I talk about then what I call the 4 principles of competing successfully, is this notion about, economic disengagement versus economic decoupling. All right. And I mean, there is a lot of evidence that particularly, American allies who are very much vested right now with Chinese economics and would have enormous pain beyond even our American pain in decoupling from China economically, that we're going to have to work with them in limited areas to disengage. And I mentioned these areas earlier, so I'll just touch on them again here, is, disengage from China in places where we need to limit vulnerability to Chinese surveillance and sabotage of our industries and particularly our security systems. Second, to assure that we have no supply chain dependencies that could enable Chinese coercion or disruption in a case of greater confrontation or conflict. And then finally, in a way that will slow diffusion of innovation and tech into China, okay, particularly in these critical leadership and military competitive edge areas. And so that being kind of the framework, a de minimis framework for disengagement with China in an era of competition, as opposed to radical decoupling, which is probably not pragmatic anyway, but you've seen probably, as I have, a lot of pundits arguing that we should be heading in that direction. And indeed, the former administration attempted perhaps a bit of that with the way it applied some of the sanctions that it took forward. So what does that mean that we should focus and manage here in the era of great power competition? And here I flag up 4 principles that tie back to the historical review I talked about earlier, and that I think apply right now to how we're seeing America move forward. Firmness and flexibility as a key principle, partnerships and alternative geometries, being careful about the poison of mass denigration, and playing for time. A little bit about those each here very quickly. First, the firmness and flexibility dimension. Okay, this notion that, we need to recognize in America that we're not going to be able to cooperate or collaborate in many, many different areas with Russia and China. That doesn't mean there aren't some we can collaborate and cooperate with, and I'll talk about those in a couple of seconds when I talk about the Biden administration. But basically, to be firm is to assess and clearly signal, particularly to the Chinese, non-negotiable U.S. strategic aims. And we have to be clear about those in our own minds in order to establish them and to convey them. Next, we need to negotiate on other strategic desires that are not non-negotiable. Third, we need to demonstrate our cohesion and commitment with allies. More about that in a second. Then we need to adapt our tactics and techniques to work within our partnerships and to stand against Chinese attempts to split those apart. And then finally, we need to understand that right now, Chinese are at a power disadvantage in just about all areas except for economics in the Indo-Pacific compared to the U.S. Now, that may skew in future years, but right now, China does not have the power capabilities to stand up against the U.S. universally. And so U.S. setting these firm, non-negotiable areas and negotiating in other critical areas is the right approach for now, without risking an unintended war. Second, and this is repeated, but I think it's really important, because partnerships are the high cards right now in U.S. strategic competition, right? Our ability to do partnerships and alliances pale against what the Chinese can do. This is an imperative from any study of great power competition, particularly in multipolar periods with a rising challenger. We see when we look at the cases that we looked at that willing coalitions against Napoleon, Imperial Germany, fascists, and against USSR and vassal state arrangements all prevailed in the end. All right. And so that's a critical dynamic, and we need to treat alliances and partnership as these high cards and find ways to establish what I call geometries, economic, diplomatic, and political, as options to China, to give countries choices that may feel like they don't have choices right now. Next, there's this poison of mass denigration, and I talked about it earlier, but I think it's important to recognize so that we don't, collapse into some things that would turn competition into confrontation and clash when it doesn't need to be. As I mentioned earlier, reciprocal mass denigration of somebody else's society is a lagging indicator of imminent potential for clash between great power. So external rhetoric and actions matter, okay? But so too does treatment of domestic ethnic groups, right? If one does this badly as a great power, one can stoke the other side's nationalism, virulent nationalism. And I think that's a real great risk with the Chinese, right? We know they play on, American xenophobia and criticism and bad treatment of Asian nationals. So calibration here is tricky. It's important that one be able to call out the policies and the leaders of one country, but not call out their entire people. And part of the way to do this, I think, is to properly view Chinese expatriates as an asset, not something to be eliminated, but rather to work with and include them in our processes of staying robust and being resilient and being open in our approach to societies. And finally, this notion of playing for time, right? Avoiding unnecessarily clashing right now. Near-term overreaction is always a danger. Some are writing right now that, time's not in the favor of America and we should act fast and, cut China off at the knees. Well, those arguments are based on 2 assumptions that aren't always true. One assumption is that the ascent of a rising power is always rapid. Well, historically, that's not true. Quite often that takes decades for a great power to rise over time. And the Chinese are moving in a very notable fashion, but not in a fashion that's going to put them as a America direct power competitor anytime soon. And second, we assume in these claims that the ascent of a great power is always linear. That is, it doesn't run into speed bumps, reversals, or changes. And that gets to my third bullet here, which is when one looks inside China, and this is not to say America doesn't have its own challenges, but China has non-trivial challenges that could quite easily speed bump or reverse its rise if not managed well by the Chinese Communist Party. aging population that are becoming less productive economically, great income inequalities, vast corruption, an environment that's, beside itself in terms of decay and erosion, restive regions, Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia that the Chinese are trying to hold together, Hong Kong, and then political power abuse and poor human rights. I mean, any of these could reverse China and should make it so that the United States sees as a key principle of playing for time. Allow these contradictions to play out in China and not assume that China is going to get its act together and be this great competitor to us, this rival that we can't possibly stand up against anytime soon. So that, coupled with U.S. rejuvenation and resilience, is far better than strategic overreaction. And so you'll note here on the slides, I've kind of put this little, four arrowed quad thing here for the four principles. And I wanted to hold to those because these are independently established and determined. But now when I look at and ask you to join me in looking at kind of where the Biden administration is showing itself thus far in moving ahead, I wanted to highlight for you some places where I think this move ahead with the Biden administration is capturing these four principles. All right. First, let's not kid ourselves. The Biden administration arrives confronting some 30 to 35% of American voters who are jaded about international commitments, who show themselves consistently in polls as being unwilling to sign up for sending American resources to other rich nations to combat major problems, right? And we also know that fully decoupling from the Chinese economy is going to be very hard for a lot of people in this country, all right? So those are givens in these top two bullets. So the Biden administration, though, has brought aboard some folks who have told us in their time out of government what they prefer and how they're going to treat both great power competition in terms of whether it's a proper description of the environment and then how to pursue great power competition. And a couple of names I wanted to flag up for you here in the top left corner, our new national security advisor, Mr. Jake Sullivan, and his co-author, Mr. Kurt Campbell, Dr. Kurt Campbell, who is now working for Sullivan as the director for the Indo-Pacific. They wrote in Foreign Affairs, that this notion of China and the U.S. as being competitors is one that matters and is one that's going to be with us for a while. And I put in the little blue and gray call-out box a quote from their article that I think is telling, and this was telling even before they were named to positions. And that is, historically, the U.S. has sought to cooperate first and compete second with China. Beijing, meanwhile, has become quite comfortable competing first and cooperating second. This must reverse. And so I think that is what we should expect here going forward. Competition, though, not clash. And then our new Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, in the lower left-hand part of the slide, was quoted even before he left government in April of 2016, is that, while we want to pursue cooperation with China, we do have to make sure that we manage differences and acknowledge differences. And so I think the dominant themes even going into this administration were that they acknowledge great power competition as an accurate description of the current environment. Okay, but they're going to be more attentive to opportunities to collaborate where they can find them. They're going to emphasize alliances and partnerships, which is one of the things we talked about. They're also acknowledging that Americans want to lead international organizations, but that there's a limit to how much we should spend on that. And we're going to need reciprocal participation from our alliances. So the bottom line going in is the diagnosis of the Biden administration is largely that, the great power competition diagnosis of the environment is accurate, but America's implementation has been wrong and must be supplanted. And so supplanted with what? And that's the last slide before discussions and questions. I think we kind of got the what right now about 2 weeks ago, okay? March 3rd, we had, bookended releases. First from the State Department, Secretary Blinken announced a foreign policy for the American people. If you haven't read it, I think you should. There's a reason that he went first, and then what came second in the afternoon was a release of the interim National Strategic Security Guidance. They parallel each other, and they also highlight the fact that for President Biden, it's going to be diplomacy that leads military. And you see that right now as Biden and Blinken traveled together to Japan and South Korea over the last couple of days to work as a partnership team. And so what came from the foreign policy for the American people from Biden really was an 8-item platform that highlighted places where this administration hopes to be able to, cooperate with China and Russia, or at least collaborate with them, but also where they acknowledged competition is inevitable. And so the top couple of bullets there, stopping COVID-19, ending the economic crisis, I mean, those are things where there may be scope for collaboration with the Chinese, and they're going to find out. Renewing democracy, that's something that America is going to continue to assert, and if China doesn't like it, they're just going to have to live with it. And then to be humane and effective on the immigration system. But I flag up 3 of the last 4 here, because you see he talked directly, Blinken did, to revitalizing ties with allies and partners, to securing U.S. leadership in technology, which is going to require government intervention, and then to managing the challenging relationship with China as a key partnership era. And so those were key in that presentation. And then later in the day, that afternoon, we had the release of an interim national security guidance, which really, anchored around the lower 3 points there. Defending U.S. strengths, promoting a favorable distribution in the wider system, and to lead and sustain the international system. So this notion that America is indeed at a place where global power changes have begat Russia and China as challengers. The norms that we value are challenged, need to be protected, and that we're going to do that with allies and partners, and with looking for places to collaborate with China and Russia, but also entering, as Jake Sullivan had said in that quote from Foreign Affairs that I showed on the last slide, entering with the notion that America is going to compete first and then ask where to collaborate second. And so I think where we're at then is we're in an era where great power competition is acknowledged by the United States as the paradigm that we're operating in, and that the way in which we're going to pursue that now with a diplomacy-led competitive framework, finding places to collaborate and if possible cooperate, but competing assertively and aggressively is where we're going to move going forward. So with that, I thank you for your time, and I hope that we've got enough time left here for some robust questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lynch. So now we're going to move on to the Q&A portion of the team session. So if you have any questions, feel free to keep submitting them through the live event Q&A chat. Okay, so our first question is, yesterday Russia recalled its ambassador to the US after President Biden agreed with a question that characterized President Putin as a killer and promised a response to election interference. The US is signaling increased competition and perhaps confrontation with regards to Russia. How do you expect Russia to respond?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a great question. And if I can harken back to the slide and the little graphic I showed you about areas where states compete, military, economic, informational, ideological, well, in there is political and diplomatic. And so I think what we're seeing right now is, our president has declared that, as you saw in the documents and the foreign policy speech I had in my very last slide, said, we're going to compete with Russia. We're not going to soft sell this, or we're not going to do like the last president did and say nothing about, Russian actions or activities. So he said something. Now the Russians have decided our competition is going to be diplomatic right now. We're going to go ahead and we're going to break relations. On a scale of things, that's not, over the top. I mean, we see that happen a lot. We've recalled our ambassadors from countries that we thought have done things that were offensive to human rights or our standing and principles. So they're gonna show a tit for tat here, but I think right now at a lower level. I would expect that we're going to continue to ratchet up, though. We're going to see what additional steps beyond sanctions, economic sanctions, or travel restrictions might come for Russians. And so I think we're going to see more competition there. True and robust competition with Russia than perhaps we saw in the 4 years of the last administration. And so I see this as an initial step, but the competition being taken in a direction of, oh, well, Russia's not going to, right now, threaten to, nuke, Europe because, President Biden says that he holds Putin accountable. They're going to take this initial diplomatic step. And again, that is much more the norm for great power competitions throughout history. Tit for tat in other competitive areas, not just a rollover and play dead by a competitive country that believes itself to be a great power, but starting at a lower threshold and then going through other steps in these other areas of competitive dynamic. I hope that helps.
All right, I think it does. Thank you, Dr. Lynch. This next question is from Dear Beloved. And this question is, was Russia's decision to annex Crimea based on a perceived threat to vital interests where Russia was unwilling to compromise? And do you foresee any other vital interests that Russia might perceive to be under threat in the next decade?
Right. Excellent questions. I'm going to do another plug for the book. because we have two chapters in there, chapters 3A and 3B, that kind of talk through Russia, China, and the U.S., first in terms of their strategic aims and orientations, and then in terms of their respective power tools and ability to accomplish and achieve things. And in that, we kind of discuss the steps that took us on the road from America's unipolar moment and cooperation and collaboration, all the way down to where we are now, which is a much more competitive environment where there's no longer delusions that the Russians want to grow up and be more like us, or the Chinese want to grow and be more like us in all these areas. And so in that 2014/2013, the buildup to Crimea is an interesting example of something that, you know, when one looks historically, Vladimir Putin had been signaling since he arrived in power in 1999, hypercritical of how he felt Russia had been mistreated by America, had been pushed off the high table of great powers, and how he needed to reestablish that, and how part of that reestablishment was to reassert Russia's dominance in its near abroad. And part of its near abroad for decades, if not centuries, had been Belarus, the Ukraine, and Crimea. And you know, Putin's first real signal was a speech he made in Munich in 2007, where he accused NATO of being a dominant and a hubristic alliance that had short-shrifted Russia, and that if NATO continued to try to expand into the areas of Russia's near abroad, there would be consequences. A year later, Russia did invade Georgia in 2008, summertime, and they annexed a province called Abkhazia. And part of that was to get a leg up on what was a process in NATO of potentially wanting to admit Georgia. Well, fast forward then, to 2014, right after the Russian Winter Olympics in Sochi ends, and Putin takes the same steps, basically, with Crimea, an area and an agency where Putin thought that the Soviet Union was wrongly, told to renege rights to Crimea, a long-standing important naval area in the Black Sea, and that it was his right to reassert that, and the domestic unrest ongoing in Ukraine was his moment to do that. And so he did, and then he followed up in the Ukraine. So, I mean, I think there's a pattern here where, one sees that was happening. One sees that was happening in areas where Putin, attempting to reassert Russia's great power status and to show a willingness to use Russia's great power tools in its near abroad, executed what he said he was going to do. And if anything, we are at a point now where, America has recognized that. Some, although not all of our NATO allies have recognized that. And there are steps that are being taken to try to harden or stand in the way of any other kinds of aggressive moves by Vladimir Putin. And I should also add that discussions about expanding NATO any further into the East, kind of came to an end there, in 2014. And in that sense, Putin kind of, got what he wanted out of it, even though he may not have gotten what he wanted in Ukraine quite yet. And so I think understanding this is, the actions of a state that is a great power, albeit it's one that has a lot of very poor cards in terms of economics and demographics and other things, but it has cards that it's playing very well in its near abroad. I think that's the right understanding of what Putin's up to and what Putin will continue to be up to unless or until there's something else that happens that pushes him aside. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lynch. So let's shift over to today's most liked question, and that's posed by Jim Krupe. And he asks what your thoughts are on creating a non-military NATO-like set of economic alliances based on strategic supply chain protection in areas like semiconductors, medicine, et cetera.
Yeah, hey, excellent question. There's a lot you packed into the question that I'll try to unpack here quickly. So in my experience working internationally, whenever one raises the specter of NATO and then starts to talk about economics or diplomatics or information, a lot of world leaders kind of, put their head down and want to change the conversation, right? So, NATO and alliances kind of, it raises the specter of mutual defense, right? That's one of the things of the NATO alliance that's made it unique. And so let's disentangle NATO and say that raising that specter is going to scare off more people than it's going to, invite to the discussion. But the rest of the point is a very valid point, and that is the United States trying to figure a way right now with our allies to establish partnerships and protocols and maybe even institutions that allow us to work to protect those categories of high tech that are critical to our domestic security, to our stability, and to human rights processes. And there's actually a proposal on the table about this right now that I think the Biden administration is going to look at very, very carefully. And that's a consortium of US, West Europe, and then other big tech players known as, euphemistically right now, is the T12, which would include South Africa, India, as well as other countries, and that those countries come together and start to establish norms, rules, procedures, and quite frankly, ethical guidelines for how to use these high-end techno things, AI, the 5G technology, critical surveillance, Internet of Things, big data collection, that we bring that together and that group be a group where we can talk frankly, share openly, and then try to protect from outside penetration those who don't want to share those rules, norms, and procedures. And so we start to then trade amongst ourselves. We value each other. We exchange goods and services with each other, and not with outside states that may not share the agreements and the protocols established in that kind of an arrangement. So that arrangement would look a little bit like a techno G7, which is the global economics kind of, group or cluster that was the G8 for a while with Russia before Russia got sanctioned and then quit. So I think you're onto something there. That is something that I think we're going to kind of see. It might start with this techno T12 and then, move or evolve into something else specific. But I think that is the way ahead, and I think that's probably what we're going to start to see here going forward.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lynch. This next question is from Keith Offwitz, from OpNav. And this question is, GPC always seems to frame the issue as the US versus the others. But as you mentioned, our strength comes in large part from our multiple alliances and partnerships. So how can we take further advantage of those relationships among democratic societies?
Yeah, hey, great question. And I'm going to take the bait. I'm going to answer the first part of it as well, because I get a lot of this from my State Department friends and colleagues. And I understand where they're coming from. Oh, this GPC thing, it's got competition in it. And so, oh my gosh, can't we cooperate? Don't we have things to get along with? Yes, and yes. Again, back to the slide I showed you. Competition is not complete confrontation. Competition is not clash. Competition amongst the great powers is jousting back and forth for influence, for legitimacy, and for outcomes. Influence and legitimacy necessarily involve getting others to come along, okay? And so it absolutely, then, to the second part of your question, that's exactly what we need to be doing. That's what we need to be finding a way to do. Now, it sounds easy, it briefs nice, but it's messy, right? You're an OpNav. You probably, deal periodically like I do with the Indians, right? They got their own ideas. Boy, you sit down with them and suddenly you get an earful of stuff that, sounds over the moon. How are you gonna accommodate them? Well, this though is the challenge of diplomacy, and even, mill-to-mill diplomacy. Find a way to accommodate their views. Find a way to keep pursuing your own common values, your own common interests, and then build a framework and a structure that protects your interests and your influence. And then if your competitor states say, wow, that looks good to us, maybe we want to join too, then you negotiate with them. And if they instead say, no, that stinks, that doesn't work for the way we want to see our country or see our world, and they want to stay on the outside, well, then you and your partner still continue to compete with them. You see what I'm saying? And so there is nothing inherent about the great power competition mantra that either precludes collaboration with your competitor right now, and certainly that doesn't preclude, and matter of fact, it emphasizes, if done properly, you engaging not as a unilateral monolith, but engaging with like-minded partners and those to act in a common cause with. And so those things actually go together. And that's what I'm trying to claim here. Now, I understand if one looks at the last 4 years of American policy and history, you would have a great trouble figuring out how we were treating allies well, trying to build them a seat at the table, trying to, accommodate their interests, build ours with theirs, and show a common front. Well, my point in the last couple of slides is to say, the last 4 years don't share much, I think, with the coming 4 years, other than an agreement that the condition of the environment of the world is one of great power competition. All other players, to include the smaller players, can't take any moves on their own without thinking about what these other three great powers may have in mind. That's a condition of the environment. That is what I want to make sure you don't lose in understanding about where we're at. Now, the pursuit of cooperative arrangements with allies and partners, yeah, that's good, but it's not the same as it was in the unipolar period. And it's definitely not the same as it was in the Cold War bipolar period. It's conditioned by this three-way competitive great power dynamic. But within that, there's a hell of a lot of competition that can be conducted that will be collaborative with our allies and not competitive with them if we want to make it work. I hope that helps.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Lynch. For our audience's knowledge, we are going to be going over time by about 15 minutes just to address the remaining questions that we have here, since we have about 9 or 10 remaining. Okay, so this next question comes from Gerald Epstein, and the question is, if we had known in 2004 to 2007 what we know now, could skillful U.S. leadership have shaped the U.S.-China relationship into one that doesn't pose as significant a threat of war? Or was China's dissatisfaction with the world order inevitable?
Yeah, a great question. One that I have hopefully an informed opinion on, but one where a lot of great scholars disagree. As to whether or not anything could have been done there. I personally would suggest that by the time of 2004, 2005, Russia was a decade and a half into feeling like it had been slighted, it had been pushed off the high table, it had been unfairly treated, and the rise of Vladimir Putin was a symptom of, not a cause of that. So, by the time we get to 2004, 2005, America and Western allies have already taken in their mind a lot of steps to tell Russia, no, you're still loved, you're still engaged, you're still involved. Russia was part of the G8. Russia had a advisor and mentor seat at NATO, for heaven's sakes. The French weren't even there for a decade and a half. They had advisor mentor role. Putin was being discussed, in the UN as one of the high and great rising rivals. But at the same time, America's interests in promoting democracy, promoting human rights, promoting independent choices by states and countries that were in what Russia historically had considered its near abroad. I mean, all those things were proceeding apace. And it was very hard to see that the Western countries were just going to hit the brakes on those because this guy Putin came into power and was grousing. And so, there are some scholars that want to say, well, you see, Putin was signaling, and if the Americans just hadn't encouraged the NATO discussion of expansion to Ukraine and Georgia in 2007, that Putin would have been quiet and gone away. I don't know. I think the facts of the circumstance and some of the literature that I think is the best on this suggest no, that wasn't the case. That there was probably not much that could have been done at that point to make Russia see itself, as having been aggrieved, and that it was going to take steps to realign its order. And then the other part of this, though, is also the notion that we have to mention here, because it's the elephant in the room. It's the approach to leadership of Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs, or his kleptocracy. Let's not forget for a moment that as the Soviet Union was dissolving, it was kind of a free-for-all in the 1990s, where very assertive, large political figures were basically cannibalizing and pulling into their own orbits all the privatized stuff from the Soviet Union's control of the economy, whether it be the oil or the industry or the gas or the transportation. I mean, all these, oligarchic barons were pulling them into themselves. And Putin arrives, and initially people think, well, he's the KGB guy. Maybe he's going to get that all back under state control. Well, no, he didn't. So initially people breathed a sigh of relief. Oh, okay, he's not going to be that KGB guy, pull it all back together. Well, in reality, we now know what he did is he just established himself as the head mob boss, right? So he basically endorsed and took, a fealty and ownership of the privatization, and then more importantly, the wealth expropriation. That is the movement of the wealth from all those organizations and agencies offshore to Western banks, to Western investments in Dhaka's and villas in Yalta or in Kensington in London or in Miami in Florida. You know the drill here. So they moved all that stuff out. And so by this time, 04 and 05, Russia is a kleptocracy, a privatized, governmentally sanctioned kleptocracy. And it's really hard to imagine how that kind of a country was going to come to accommodations, with the Western world and just play nicer if we just treated them better in 2004, 2005. I mean, if anything, arguably the international terrorist diversion that we all had, the West and also Russia. Remember, Russia was under a terrorist Islamic threat too. I mean, that kind of diverted our attention. And by the time our attention came back, 2010, 2011, 2012, we were way, way too far apart at that point to figure that we were going to see eye to eye anymore with Russia is just going to become more like us. So no, while there's a lot of good literature out there, some scholarship that says, there was this case, I am more persuaded that by 04, 05, the natural course of international relations had taken hold. There was resentment and jealousy in Russia. There was a framework that Putin had authorized and established that was basically saying, no, we want a different set of rules and procedures for us, and we want to sit at the high table and being appreciated for what we have and want. And that was never going to work for what the U.S. and the West thought they were going to get out of Russia. Never going to work. So I don't see this. I see it kind of as an inevitability and a fact, as I mentioned in the presentation, that it was very atypical in the last 500 years to have such a dominant single state being able to dictate to all these others. It's inevitable they were going to get resentful and want their own way. And Russia, just kind of let out with that in the mid 2000s. And then, China has followed suit. So I'd offer you that answer, but I acknowledge there's some other good literature out there that says, there might have been some better ways to appease Putin. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lynch. What about China? Do you think that had U.S. leadership known what they know today, that China and the U.S. wouldn't be in this position right now? Or do you think that China's dissatisfaction with the world order was inevitable?
Right. So another good question, another what scholars in the field like to call a counterfactual. Right. Well, let's go back and try to assess whether we could have done it better, if we can just throw our own preconditions and our own, determinants on it. So that's always rife with challenges. But again, I'm willing to do that. I'm willing to go back and say, from a realist lens or perspective, one would say that, again, a U.S. expectation that as China got more economically powerful, it was going to just walk like, talk like, quack like, be like us. That in a realist terms, that was always unrealistic, right? And that the U.S. kind of gamble here in helping China move forward was based upon, first, some sound logic, which was in 1978 when China made the move towards economics outward-looking international economics and market-based systems inside the country, that in 1978, with the Cold War still raging, for the U.S., it was a win to have China move in that direction. Why in heck would we want to start putting conditions on how much of it was state-owned or how much of it wasn't, or whether or not the Communist Party had to go away? So we kind of, by the move through the mid-'80s, with the speed bump of Tiananmen Square in there acknowledged, we kind of moved to this position of, okay, we're going to roll the dice on China. We're going to help it. I mean, it's definitely helping us to end the Cold War on our terms. We would rather have it as an engaged partner than an immediate new rival after the Cold War ended, right? And so, we're going to continue to work with it. And we're also going to, many of us, hang our hat on this notion that just like in the Western countries in the Middle Ages, that as China's middle class grows wealthy. That wealth will beget political interest. The political interest will convey into demand for political participation. The political participation will erode the party, and therefore China will become looking more like us. I mean, that was the kind of thesis in the 80s and the 90s, despite Tiananmen Square. I don't personally think that was unreasonable. I was alive then. I wouldn't have wanted another Cold War with the Chinese to come right after we got done with the Cold War with the Russians. But as we moved forward, I think there was a time, particularly in 2001, where we had to bend over backwards to get the Chinese to come into the World Trade Organization because there was so much of their economy that was still so much state-driven and so much managed in a way that was inimical to the Western countries that by about 2001, there was probably a reckoning. We probably had to have looked more seriously at whether or not we had this right and whether or not China was going to be, a future engaged and potential partner. But then this other thing historically happened, folks. This speed bump on the way to figuring out whether we needed to be more assertive with China. And it was 9/11, okay? And all of us, periscope here, China, periscope there. And that was our next decade. And by the time we come out the back end of that, China's had another decade, in some cases unfettered, to move in the direction of their own state-owned enterprises, to cut their own rules, some of which we find very, very offensive economically, like espionage and spying and intellectual property theft and other things. And so we come out the other end of the window. And so, I'm not a historical determinist, but I think there are reasons to explain why U.S. choices from 78 to 2000 were wise ones, why we can argue in 2001 there was probably prima facie evidence. And I think the Bush administration was picking up on that. And I think we were seeing some already testy moments, if you recall, early in the Bush administration with a Navy plane being detained and some other back and forths with China in the East China Seas. But then 9/11 happened. And we spent the next decade in another direction. And then we spent coming out of, the 9/11 decade in the 2011-2012 period, and we still desperately wanted China to be on side. And we saw them as a partner, as I mentioned in my briefing, we saw them as a partner to recover the international economy. So then there was still kind of this hope and this prayer. But then finally, once we get into the 13, 14, and 15 period with South China Sea, with threats to Hong Kong, with threats to Taiwan, with the way in which China promises they're going to do certain things in intellectual property but doesn't, then we kind of get to that point. And so, again, I'm not a historical determinist. Oh, it would have happened this way no matter what. But I think it's important to understand, folks, that you can't just go back and rewrite history without understanding the calculus at the time. And China, as a bet for the first 20 to 25 years, is maybe going to look more like, walk like, and talk like us and not become another Cold War adversary. That was a better bet than the alternative. I hope that helps.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Lynch. So we've got about 2.5 more minutes with the Q&A session. So I'm going to give the last opportunity for a question to our fearless leader, Mr. Todd Veazey. So this question is, as we consider long-term strategic competition with great powers like China, where a transition of great state dominance might be inevitable, i.e. the US replaced by China, in the current environment, is a cogent unifying theory of victory realistic, or do we muddle through as the events unfold?
Yeah, great question. So my cards on the table. My colleague here, Dr. Frank Hoffman, has written an exceptional piece and teaches and lectures in our war college and in international war college on it's not a theory of victory, it's a theory of success. And I'm going to shamelessly borrow from him because I think he's got it right. Okay, in this competition, the long haul competition, it's not about victory or winning or vanquishing. It's about succeeding. Succeeding how? Having more influence with more partners. Having more of our way of doing things being seen as the right-minded way with a if not expanding, at least a robust and healthy collective apparatus and organization that agrees and aligns, not in all areas, but in most areas, including ideology, political and diplomatics, how we do information, how we develop technologies responsibly, how we, share economically, even though we're going to, compete some economics, we're going to, have a set of rules we're going to live by. And then how militarily do we cooperate with each other, to mitigate threats without, being boisterous or hubristic. I mean, that's a theory of success. Okay, that's different than a theory of victory. And we in the military, you know, and I'm retired after 28 years in the military. I know, I went through all the professional schools. I did all that stuff. I get it. We love the theory of victory, right? But we're in a competition. We're not in a conflict or a conflagration. Our aim here with a whole of system approach is, as I put in a couple of those slides, to have success without conflagration or war. And indeed, part of success is not having the conflagration or the war any sooner than you need to have. Now, I'm going to be honest again, 75% of these kinds of, you know, multiple great power competitions with a one or more rising power, I mean, they have ended with great power conflagration. I mean, that's not a good statistic. But in that other 25%, there's the hope. But that hope requires good leadership, good focus, clear messaging, and not getting deluded by this notion that we're going to have victory. We're going to vanquish these guys. Oh, the Communist Party of China is going to fall apart and walk away, right? That wasn't a multipolar competition that happened in, by the way, folks, with the Soviet Union, United States. That was a bipolar competition where both states thought themselves ascendant until one figured out they weren't. And then, even then, it took a leader like Gorbachev to do something that the previous three leaders never did, which was acknowledge it, right? So if we're waiting on that, if that's our theory of victory, we're going to lose, okay? If we got a theory of success and we're going to partner with folks and we're going to understand these imperatives and these principles I just talked about, then we got a good chance to win without having to fight. And that's success. Does that help?
I think it does, and I'm getting the thumbs up from Todd, so I think it did. Well, that's a great place to end today's speaker session. So thank you everyone for tuning in today. We do still have quite a few questions, so if you'd like for those to be addressed, feel free to email me and I'll pass along your questions to Dr. Lynch. But anyways, thank you everyone for tuning in again, and thank you, Dr. Lynch, for taking the time to present.
My pleasure. Thank you all. Have a great day.
All right, have a great day.